In a time when silence was safe and obedience was expected, a small group of students and a professor chose the perilous path of dissent. They were not trained revolutionaries, nor did they command armies. But their names have endured because they dared to raise their voices against one of the most brutal regimes in modern history. This is the story of the White Rose, a non-violent resistance group in Nazi Germany whose courage continues to inspire generations. By the early 1940s, Adolf Hitler's grip on Germany was absolute. The Nazi regime had effectively dismantled democratic institutions, silenced the press, criminalized dissent, and established a surveillance state that penetrated every aspect of German life. Fear was omnipresent. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, operated without restraint, and the mere whisper of criticism could lead to imprisonment or death. Yet amid this climate of terror, a quiet resistance was forming within the walls of the University of Munich. At the heart of it were a group of young students who had grown disillusioned with the regime's lies, brutality, and moral bankruptcy. Hans Scholl, born in 1918, had once been an enthusiastic member of the Hitler Youth. Like many German youths, he was drawn to the promises of camaraderie, adventure, and national pride. But over time, Hans began to see the contradictions between Nazi ideology and his own Christian values and philosophical beliefs. He became increasingly disturbed by the regime's suppression of individual thought and its brutal treatment of Jews and other marginalized groups. His younger sister, Sophie Scholl, born in 1921, shared his intellectual curiosity and moral clarity. She was bright, independent-minded, and deeply spiritual. The siblings were raised in a household that valued free thought, moral responsibility, and opposition to tyranny. Their father, Robert Scholl, had openly criticized the Nazis and was once jailed for calling Hitler a scourge of God. Together with their close friends, Christoph Probst, Alexander Schmorell, and Willy Graf, the Scholls formed the core of what would become the White Rose movement. Later, they were joined and mentored by Professor Kurt Huber, a philosopher and musicologist whose lectures often contained veiled criticisms of the regime. The White Rose chose a powerful but dangerous weapon, the written word. In the summer of 1942, the group began writing and distributing a series of anonymous leaflets that exposed the crimes of the Nazi regime and called on Germans to resist. The first leaflet, titled Leaflet of the White Rose, began with an uncompromising statement. Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by an irresponsible clique. The text went on to condemn the genocide of Jews, the persecution of dissenters, and the moral decay of German society under Hitler. Over the next several months, the group produced 6 leaflets in total, each more urgent and impassioned than the last. They quoted Goethe, Schiller, and Aristotle, appealing to the conscience and intellect of their readers. The language was elevated, but the message was clear. The regime was evil, and it was the moral duty of every German to resist. Producing and distributing the leaflets was perilous work. The members of the White Rose operated in secrecy, often working late into the night using a hand-cranked duplicating machine hidden in their apartments. They traveled across southern Germany by train, leaving stacks of leaflets in phone booths, mailboxes, and university buildings. Their goal was to awaken the German people from the stupor of propaganda and fear. In early 1943, after the disastrous German defeat at Stalingrad, the mood in the country began to shift. The White Rose saw an opportunity to escalate their efforts. On February 18th, Hans and Sophie brought a suitcase full of leaflets to the University of Munich. As students attended lectures, the siblings distributed the leaflets in empty corridors. Before leaving, Sophie impulsively climbed to the top floor and scattered the remaining copies into the atrium below. It was a symbolic act of defiance, but it also proved to be their undoing. A university janitor and staunch Nazi supporter witnessed the act and reported them to the Gestapo. Hans and Sophie were arrested on the spot. The Gestapo found a draft of the next leaflet, written by Christoph Probst, in Hans's pocket. Within days, Christoph was also arrested. The three were subjected to intense interrogation, but they refused to betray their comrades. The trial of Hans, Sophie, and Christoph was held on February 22, 1943, in the notorious People's Court, presided over by Judge Roland Freisler. It was a sham proceeding. The outcome was predetermined, and the accused were denied any real defense. Despite the gravity of their situation, Hans and Sophie remained defiant. When asked if she regretted her actions, Sophie replied, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare express themselves as we did." All three were sentenced to death for treason and executed by guillotine that same day. Hans's last words were reported to be, "Long live freedom." The execution of the Scholls and Probst sent shockwaves through their community. Within the next few months, other members of the White Rose, including Willy Graf, Alexander Schmerel, and Professor Kurt Huber, were also arrested, tried, and executed. But their sacrifice was not in vain. Copies of their final leaflet were smuggled out of Germany and eventually made their way to the Allied forces. In July 1943, millions of copies were airdropped over Germany by the Royal Air Force, now bearing the title, The Manifesto of the Students of Munich. The story of the White Rose began to spread, quietly at first, and then with greater resonance in the post-war years. The bravery of a handful of students and a professor had become a symbol of moral resistance and intellectual courage. Today, the White Rose is commemorated in Germany and around the world. Schools, streets, and squares bear their names. Monuments and museums honor their memory. The University of Munich has a permanent exhibition dedicated to the group, and a bronze tribute in the form of scattered leaflets marks the site where Hans and Sophie were arrested. Their story raises profound questions about conscience, complicity, and courage. What does it mean to resist evil in a time of danger? How can the voice of a few challenge the power of a regime built on lies and violence? The White Rose reminds us that heroism is not always loud. It can be the quiet act of writing a leaflet, the bold step of speaking truth to power, the steadfast refusal to accept injustice. It tells us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can resist. The story of the White Rose is not merely a tale of historical interest. It is a moral compass, a mirror held up to every generation. It compels us to ask, would I have spoken out? Would I have risked everything for truth? Hans and Sophie Scholl, Christoph Probst, Alexander Schmerel, Willy Graf, and Kurt Huber did not live to see the fall of the regime they opposed. But their legacy endures. They chose conscience over comfort, truth over lies, and freedom over fear. And because of that choice, they are not forgotten. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Until next time, remain curious.